All right, so welcome back. Appreciate everybody being here this afternoon and sticking around for our panel. The agenda, the talk for today on this panel is really focusing on horizontal integration. So I touched a little bit on this earlier in my talk earlier in the day, but really the focus is on how are we integrating across the vendor community, and what are the things that we need to do, what are the challenges with integration today, and where can we go and where are some of the vendors going. So we have an outstanding panel here. I'm going to let them say a bit about themselves, but by way of introductions, I will introduce at the far end Efrain Ortiz, who is the Director of Marketing Technology Innovation for Symantec Corporation. We have Naasief Edross, who is the Senior Technical Leader at Cisco. Mr. Mike Ward, who is the Director of Security Engineering Federal for Palo Alto Networks. And then last but not least, we have Jason Mock, who is the Deputy Lead of our IACD integration team here at Johns Hopkins APL. So welcome, thank you for being here today. So I'm gonna let you each have take a moment to give a little background on yourselves and maybe any opening remarks, and then we'll get started with some questions. I'll start things off with the questions. But please, if you would like to chime in, the mics are open, and we would definitely would like you to have an opportunity to ask your questions of the panel. So, Efrain, you want to start?
Okay. So, Efrain Ortiz, I've been with Symantec now 16 years in different roles. In my current one, I'm working in the Symantec Ventures arm and innovation. And one of the things that I've enjoyed doing very much is the OpenC2 work in the last year and a half. So I look forward to sharing more of that.
Thanks, Efrain. Naasief Edross, I've been back at Cisco for 4 months now. Prior to that, I spent 2000 to 2015 inside the security business group at Cisco. And then I took a 3-year visit outside. And for those 3 years, I focused on automation and orchestration, been involved with IACD since 2016. I am a member of the team focusing on integrations of Cisco security technology, vertical as well as horizontal inside Cisco. So I'd love to share with the audience what we're doing, and as well as take your questions.
Mike Ward, Palo Alto Networks. I've spent about 25 years around the Beltway, both from a operator standpoint and from a public-private standpoint as well. I think what's really interesting is you don't always get that perspective. A lot of folks spend their entire life, if cybersecurity is a sword and a shield, some might use the shield all the time, some might use the sword all the time. But having the perspective of seeing both those sides and being able to understand the problems that each has is pretty important. So I run a team of about 30 engineers, and the goal for me and my team is just to make sure that customer understanding, adoption, and uptake go smoothly between my company and our federal customers. So I've experienced the problems that we're going to discuss today firsthand, from an operator standpoint and also from a technology supplier standpoint. So looking forward to the questions from everybody.
Jason Mock, Deputy Integration Team Lead. I've been working on IACD for about 3 years now. Primarily work, in the spiral experimentation, as well as some of the pilot efforts. So I've done a good bit of integration with a bunch of different products. So I'm really interested to see what they have to say about horizontal integration.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we'll get things started with I'll say a little bit of a softball question for the panel. So a lot of companies, we know through mergers, acquisitions, a lot of companies have built the ability to provide a wide range of cyber defense capabilities and bring that to their customers. So considering this, do you believe any single company can position themselves in a way to fully address the range and the sophistication of the threat that we see out there today? Right? Many are trying. Do you think that they can do that? And we'll ask that question for all the panel members. We'll give you a chance to chime in on it. But Efrain, you want to start?
Darn, I got the first seat. So if I had a sales hat on, I said yes. But no, in reality, no one company can do it, no more than we can rely on one hospital or one pharmaceutical to address all of our medical needs, right? You don't have just one doctor, you have specialist doctors. You don't have one hospital, you have specialist hospitals. And in the same token, you're going to need more than just one security vendor to address the needs. And this is where the horizontal integration is going to be key to improving our overall digital hygiene. It's my 2 cents.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, Harley, I'm in complete alignment with what he said. However, I do want to add that from our perspective, it depends on the maturity of our customers. Depending on the staff, the training, one vendor may just well suffice because that's the heritage of that staff and that workforce. So they've got institutional knowledge and they've got operational knowledge around one vendor. And so we see that being one of the factors, but as you grow in maturity, you'll find out that that's not going to be the case. So it depends on the level of maturity of the customer and the value that they get from your portfolio at that moment in time. That doesn't mean it will remain that way and static. It can definitely change, but I want to bring the people and process into the big picture to determine that answer.
So I think we've actually underscored the need for horizontal integration by saying just that, where we know that one size won't fit all. One company, one product, one technology won't solve all security woes. If anyone's been to RSA in the past 5 years, raise your hand. 1,400 security vendors. My eyes, and I'm in the industry, my eyes roll back in my head whenever I look at that and try to feel, well, which one of these vendors is going to address the problem for me? So you're seeing horizontal integration be more critical for companies, not less critical. Jason asked me before we started the panel here, you three going to be able to get along here today? Because what's the relationship like? And it's co-opetition, quite honestly. And the example that I gave was all three of us are founding members of a nonprofit organization called Cyber Threat Alliance, where we all contribute threat information to a central repository. It gets scrubbed, and then that is then shared back out to the CTA members. 15 or 20 vendors in it today. So yes, we each have shareholders and we each have responsibilities to them, but we like to say and think that there's a greater responsibility to our country and nation and our customers as a whole to make sure that all ships rise on that tide. I think that's a real long way of saying is as much as each of us would want there to be an answer of yes to that question, the answer is no. And it's critical that we learn in what ways we can interoperate together efficiently to solve your problems, and not just simply say we're the largest market player.
Yeah, I think my intuition says that if you're trying to be a jack of all trades, you'll probably be a master of none. And I found throughout the spirals that we've done that while one vendor may provide a lot of products for a lot of different roles, organizations may not want the specific role that organization plays for that product. I don't know if that was really clear, but maybe there are multiple different types of firewalls, but the use case for that organization may vary from organization to organization.
Okay. All right. So Naasief, you made a comment in your remarks that a single vendor may, depending on the organization, maybe a single vendor is, enough and sufficient for a particular organization. So I'm curious, do you see still the role of vertical integration among a suite of products, and how important is it for that vertical integration to be able to branch out horizontally as well?
Yeah, I think our customers, each of our customers is going to demand vertical integration. If I'm buying something on an enterprise agreement that's supposed to give me value of visibility and control over cybersecurity threats, I'm going to, as a customer, our customers have said we expect vertical integration. That is something that all of us will continue to work on. But that horizontal integration is something that if you don't do it, your customer will realize, wait, what is going on here? There's a big ecosystem out there that can provide me more value in a faster manner that you can, and you're holding me back. So open it up, bring it to market, and focus on me as a customer. Put yourself in the position of that user-centric interface. So to answer your question, vertical integration, very important inside every vendor, but we all recognize that to fight the good fight for cyber, you got to open things up and play nicely with others.
I agree. I think that is table stakes, quite frankly. And if we think about that to an extreme level where, great, all my pieces and parts talk together, we actually get into the opposite of the problem where we don't have good enough security maybe because we don't have the ability to add new technologies quickly. If we counter that with, great, I've got all this stuff that kind of talks together and I have to deploy all this hardware and software on my laptops and my phones and my servers and my perimeters in the cloud, wherever it might be, then you can actually get to a point where that starts to impact business. So I would argue that it's actually a consumption model that needs to change, and not just, hey, we have open APIs, so good to go. I'll go back to the reference that I did before about RSA, where if you have thousands of vendors that all say they can solve problems, and they might, the way that companies and organizations and governments are designed to ingest that technology and the way the companies have to develop so it can be ingested that way, we have smart people. They develop a way to, detect insider threat. Great. They've got to hire a sales team. They've got to hire a development team. They've got to hire a marketing team. They've got to package a product. They have to deploy that product. They have to manage that product. So that's actually stifling to innovation. So when we start talking about horizontal integration, it should be way more than simply saying we interoperate. It should be a consumption model, like a lot of the way that our phone does. Like, who's bought a flashlight in the past 5 years? Nobody, because their phone does that. I've stopped taking a DSLR on vacations because I can take just as good, if not better, pictures from my telephone. I don't carry a daytimer around anymore because this thing does it. So you can kind of imagine that security can adapt and actually benefit from that same kind of model where you have a matrix of sensors, whatever they might be, whether it's an agent, an appliance, or a virtual machine somewhere. What if I could consume all that technology and use the same sensor grid that I currently have today? I think that's a place we need to get to. We're not there yet, but we've all, as corporations, have frameworks that can allow for that. So I think it's a pretty, just saying horizontal integration means I can talk to another vendor is it's not enough.
Okay, so the mics, if anybody has questions, please come to the mic. While you're moving there, I'll ask one more question. So as organizations are looking to implement automation and where the current state of that integration is today, right? What do you see as kind of the greatest challenges with where we're at today? And I'll kind of direct this one first to Jason, because I know you live this every single day with the work we're doing with IACD.
So I think it's becoming better. Specifically from 2-3 years ago, I think it was fairly difficult to integrate between different lines of products. But now with more vendors opening up APIs and having good documentation as well, that goes a long way into writing our own custom integrations and showing that it can be done. And I think that's the bulk of our work is to take all of these products and show that the automation can be done in a way. And I think it's if you're adopting the IACD framework, I think it's really good for driving competition One of our main tenets is, bring your own enterprise. If you've already paid, so-and-so dollars for some product, you want to, and you're looking for a solution for some other problem, you want to try and find a product that already integrates with a good number of the things that you already have.
Efrain, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I just add that a standard seems to be in order to help things out. I mean, again, you knew I was going to roll OpenC2 into this at some point, right? So some kind of common language that you can share for taking actions. And in one of my hobbies, I studied mathematical stuff, and I stumbled across something called ICD-10. Nothing to do with cyber. It's like the International Classification of Diseases. And so they figured out how to name this, how to identify symptoms and diagnose things and label diseases, both physical and mental, across the planet. So that, no matter where you are on the planet, flu is tagged with a specific code. We don't have, one ring to rule them all right now. It would be nice to have a common ICD-10. That would, I think, go a long way. We're not there yet, but I think things like sticks, things like OpenC2, and even, this sounds crazy, but things like REST kind of help smooth the skids, if you will, to help with that integration. And then I want to add to Jason that APIs are great, but one thing he said that I want to stress is the documentation of the APIs, because they tend to suck. So we need better documentation, and the best part, examples, so that developers can get things integrated. Am I taking too long?
No, that's fine.
So another thing, one of the benefits of horizontal integration, kind of by accident, is that when you're a Cisco or Palo Alto and you're acquiring a company, or a Symantec, and you're acquiring a company, if that company is using open standards for communications, bada bing, you can integrate way faster. So, I mean, it's even better if you can take some of those open source or open standards and start using them in your vertical integration, then it just makes it a lot easier to merge or acquire when sometimes you're merging internally.
Okay. So, sir, we have a question?
Yes. Is this working? Yes. Mike Bostrom. Let me back up to a comment that you made before this last round of answers. One of the things that I'm a little bit concerned with horizontal integration is single point of failure. If you have a horizontal integration that's controlling everything in your network, then no matter what other advantages there are, one disadvantage is single point of failure. And I'd like to hear the panel's reaction to that.
I'll take a stab. DNS is a single point of failure. PKI is a single point of failure. So wherever you put a lot of your eggs, whatever basket that is, you're going to have to protect it like crazy. So you're going to have to add layers and layers of security. So one of the, the way we're communicating with our APIs, we have these one-time tokens, so you'd have to basically break the token system. And if you can break the token system, all right, it's yours. You deserve it, kind of, So yeah, when you start concentrating the power, you're going to have to start putting more layers where that power is. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. As part of that integration, you definitely test your failure scenarios. So if you're getting enough 404s back at it, during peak hour, it's our hope that we designed it enough to recognize that and to go to another loop around that. But the concept of resiliency would not be absent as we go through horizontal integration.
I agree. I wouldn't say that just because things are horizontally integrated means you're giving up redundancy and availability. So if your, firewall talks to your endpoint client and somehow that channel becomes compromised, okay, so that part of the channel can't talk, but that doesn't mean your firewall can't talk to your SIM or your cloud provider or your, you go on and name that list. So yeah, it doesn't take away our responsibility as security practitioners to make sure we have redundancy and availability built into whatever architectures we're integrating horizontally.
Okay?
Question.
I have a question here. This is Ashutosh Dada from APL. Who said that? Efrain, right? You talked about the open source a little bit. It's a question, open source, right? So the question is, we have 3 vendors here, security vendors, right? And Jason also made a pretty good point about integration. So do you think open source is helping integrate the products from different security vendors? Is it easy to have an open source to integrate? You know, because you have firewall, DDoS, IDS, IPS, different kinds of vendors, and they have open source community that's helping you to, service chain them or, orchestrate them whatever way. Do you think it's helping or it is becoming an obstacle?
So,
Go ahead.
I feel like I'm taking too much. I'm not sure I understood the question. Is it more around, does it make it hard for us to
Yeah, I mean, are you embracing open source community in a way? Because, if you look at the operators, they are kind of, even AT&T, Verizon, they're moving away from proprietary vendor solution and going towards open source. And I know security vendor community also going in that direction. So do you think is a good way to embrace open source?
So I haven't personally hugged the open source, but I just went through the challenge of getting code open sourced at Symantec, and it took about 2 weeks of going back and forth. So embrace. I don't know if that's an embrace, but they let me do it. And if you Google on GitHub, you'll see there's code that's been published there. If you look at the license agreements in our product, you'll see that we're using open source. But I don't know if we've been hugging the world of open source. But I will say that at least we've opened up our API, the RESTful APIs. The documentation is, right? I was able to actually do most of my coding without getting any internal help. And it's for a lot of our products. So third parties can, have fun with it.
So from APL's viewpoint, at least, typically open source products can help kind of give insight into like what standards are coming up. They'll typically use standards more frequently than various vendors. But it's kind of a double-edged sword because sometimes you'll see some open source product and you see that the last commit was like 3 years ago or something. You don't even know if it works. The documentation is kind of there, kind of not there. So, while it can help to kind of explore, I think, there's a lot of work to be done in specifically the cyber ecosystem, for open source software.
So I think it was Roger Tenenbaum that said, standards are great. There's so many to choose from. Tongue in cheek, the moral of that story is standards sound very appealing, but you got to be careful what you bet the farm on. Open source being part of that or standards-based open source. I think when you look at public companies, well, they wouldn't be public companies really if they were simply a communal type of good. Some companies do things better than others, and that's why everything is an open source. That being said, there are components of open source that are very valuable for the security ecosystem and public companies. SourceFire, right? There's still an open source version. Palo Alto Networks has a threat intelligence exchange called MindMeld. That's completely open source. You can download it on GitHub. Same thing with Symantec. So I don't think you're going to see an all or nothing approach, but you're going to see where it makes sense and it is advantageous for both consumer and supplier. Open source definitely has strengths. And you'll see in the user license agreements that within many of our products, we take advantage of open source. So although we might not be a Red Hat or Linux tomorrow, we certainly borrow from those types of environments.
And we don't brag about it too much. For example, Elasticsearch. Has anybody heard of Elasticsearch? Oh, wow. Okay, great. So we use it, and we contribute to it. Shh, don't tell anybody. But we don't brag about it. But if you look under the covers, you'll see, these different technologies we're using and contributing back to.
Harley, I have another question. Should I wait? Can I ask now?
Sure. Great.
So, the breakout session, we had an interesting breakout about detection and mitigation time. How much time it takes to detect certain attack, how much time it takes to mitigate that, whole automation systems. Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of how your products do and when you can coexist all these products? Because as a service provider, anybody in enterprise, they have certain expectation. If there is an attack happening, how quickly I solve it? We get this question from DHS and other places as well. Do you have any specific specification, standards, requirement you follow in terms of how quickly you detect and how quickly you mitigate? Let's say there's a DDoS attack, right?
So I'm not sure I heard or if I understood the question completely. It has to do with, response time?
Yes, have detection time, response time, and mitigation.
Yeah. So 3 years ago, there was a study done by, it wasn't Ponemon, but essentially the idea is a breach, any organizational breach, typically wasn't detected for about 6 or 7 months before they knew about the breach. So that means adversary has that much time to do their work. Once that breach is reported, and by the way, 60% of breaches are reported from a third party, not organically discovered by the person who's been breached, took another 243 days to clean up after that. My dad told me a long time ago, it's a lot easier not to spill the glass of milk than it is to mop up the milk after it's been spilled. So the more you can prevent up front, the smaller you can make that dwell time, if you will, the time on target that the enemy has, the better off all processes are after that, whether it's SOC, NOC, incident response, insurance, cleanup, what have you. So if you look at, for instance, the mantra that my employer uses is prevention first. Absolutely prevent what you can, automatically. Might terrify a lot of people. We don't want to, automate our CEO off the network? Certainly not. We don't want to do that. But at the same time, you have to accept some level of automation or some risk with automation always. Nothing's perfect. We'll use Google self-driving or Tesla self-driving cars as an example. A person perished in an accident of a self-driving car, which is terrible. But what that doesn't show is all the lives that have been saved because the self-driving car was able to stop quicker than a human could at a point of risk. Point being is what's an acceptable dwell time? I think it's in the minutes, 1-2 minutes before something's detected and before an organization is inoculated ubiquitously against that threat, whether it's on an endpoint, mobile phone, perimeter, cloud, wherever. And that doesn't happen without automation and horizontal integration as well. I hope that answered the question if I understood it correctly.
So I kind of want to add on to that point, and kind of just echo the sentiment that as you kind of help to facilitate horizontal integration, companies that have products from different vendors will be able to automate more easily and reduce the response time of any given incident.
Okay.
Nobody wants to see the sausage being made, if I can use that analogy. They just want to eat the sausage. So automation and horizontal integration should happen almost invisibly to the company. There is a level of trust that has to occur. If you are trusting but verifying every single transaction that occurs, you're not automating, you're slowing yourself down. So that trust has to be earned, shouldn't be given blindly, of course. But point being is you should be comfortable with hundreds of security vendors in your environment, all amplified by horizontal integration, rather than just saying, I've got one or I've got 2 or 3 security vendors in my environment.
Osama Farag with the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab.
Here.
My question
Can't hear the question.
My question is, in the morning keynotes, they discussed one of the key challenges is heterogeneous environment across organization within a sector, across sector, introduction of IoT and critical infrastructure protection adds more diversity in the environment that we are trying to defend it. And we also talked in the morning, there was discussion about that the industry has to take the lead and the government will not be the lead. So my question to the vendor community here today, do you have any thoughts of how we solve the problem of heterogeneous environment to make the horizontal integration more easier in the future, and so we can share trade crafts and things across?
I think I picked up every other word.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, so if I heard correctly, it's about how do we better integrate into the future. One of this is take off my hat a little bit, take it off from the Symantec hat, but I think we're at the beginning of a kind of it's not going to sound weird, but the beginning of a new age, if you will. We're at the dawn of cleaning up our sewage systems, or rather installing them. We're like in Victorian London in the 1850s, and we're still trying to run plumbing. So unfortunately, we happen to live in interesting times, as the old curse goes, right? So it's our job, though, to start creating the standards, setting the example, putting in the best practices for the next generation. I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but we're struggling with all the complexity. There's so many different, to continue with the London analogy, you have a 1/4-inch pipe and the other guy has a 1-inch pipe. Oh, darn, they don't work together. So we have to work on standards, all right? We're still fighting over the type of nails, sizes, and screws. We need to work on those standards, and unfortunately, we have to struggle through that. But good news is we're here. We're working as hard as we can to address customers' needs, right? So if you guys ask for a certain capability and pay for it, we build it. That's how it works. So start demanding standard connectors, demand standard APIs, and build it and they will come kind of thing. Or ask for it and they will build it. We will build it.
So over the years, I've been seeing more and more vendors kind of start trying to adopt standards while they might not be completely true to the spec. They'll start to pick up nomenclature from OpenC2, for example. A big product update for something that we work with pretty frequently. After the OpenC2 stuff came out, they saw Efrain's talk, and they started kind of putting that sort of verbiage into their product to kind of, be a pioneer and say, okay, this standard is coming up. We don't know if it's completely going to take hold, but we're going to try and, be the first people to take that first step, and, not, muddy the waters too much.
So I want to explore that, since you mentioned the OpenC2 for just a moment. Efrain, I know you had done a lot of work around OpenC2. Do you see standards like that as being helpful to the integration and helping facilitate that horizontal integration? And if so, what's missing from those type of things that can further those efforts?
So is it beneficial? Oh, heck yeah. I've been a big proponent of it internally, not just outside, so I blog about it. But I also cheer it. I'm the biggest cheerleader on OpenC2. The downside of, sorry if any of the OpenC2 guys are in here or going to watch the video, but the standard is still fluctuating. The words keep changing a bit, so we're just deciding we're just going to move forward. And it'll just evolve. We might have a word wrong here and there. And I like to use the analogy of HTML. When HTML first came out, people had the weirdest implementation of it, right? But some beautiful things came from it, right? And eventually we figured it out. So we're taking the approach of let's just go gangbusters and see where it goes. And we'll adapt and evolve as it evolves.
Question?
Hi, my name is Megan Costello, and I'm with SPAWAR. I'm a data scientist with the Department of the Navy. And my question actually segues really well with the conversation right now about the OpenC2 community. I guess my question kind of is to address the rest of the panel and ask about their companies and their involvement in the OpenC2. And an additional question is previously in this conversation, you had discussed almost like a universal kind of language and how there's so many standards. Do you see this OpenC2 community kind of being that universal standard at some point?
Whether it's OpenC2 or whether it's a different taxonomy, I do think that what you're going to see is each of all of us, I believe, will borrow and implement components of that. I can say for my employer and every employer that I've worked for in the past, are we going to become a mechanism of C2 to just be a sort of a ubiquitous sensor? Unlikely, right? There's still things that companies bring competitive advantages to the market, but where it does make sense, integrations with things like C2 or OpenStack or insert open framework / language here, that's occurring, that has been occurring. If you're asking if a commercial vendor is going to 100% support a C2 implementation and architect the solutions to OpenC2, bluntly, probably not. But what you're going to see is continued hooks into that where it makes sense. But I think that, yes, there's a lot of components to standards that all commercial vendors are going to continue to use. And quite frankly, the way that those kind of standards further or get furthered is through acquisition process, right? If the US government or whatever purchaser decides this is very important to my organization and everybody has to participate in it, demand that right into an RFP. Don't paint yourself in a corner so that only one or maybe zero can satisfy that. But yes, I think, again, a real long way of saying commercial vendors in general are going to borrow where it makes sense, but they need to maintain a competitive advantage as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that, that something that is still fluctuating will have to be approached incrementally in terms of how deep are we going to go. So from Efrain's point of view, they're going to go in probably a little faster than any of us are going to go. So we're going to sit back and monitor and see if, at the end of the day, is that really going to be, because once you start integrating, that ship sails. To pull that back and those teams to now re-engineer things might not happen immediately. So to Mike's point, if it shows up in RFP, our sales teams are going to come to engineering and say, I cannot go and bid this until you give me some support for it. So that might satisfy the checkbox, but let's talk about the customer benefit. I think to all our customers, if what OpenC2 brings or any other standard that is still developing brings, if they can reach that objective for those cyber defenders in a different way, and we are going to propose that. This is still in development. We are not going to do that yet, but let me show you how you can do that through this other method. At the end of the day, if you're achieving the same operational objective, our customers will probably say, okay, we'll give you a slide on this, but give us at least the roadmap for when you will get that. So it's all objective driven and exactly how far that is going down the path.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so one of the, as we've talked about the OpenC2, and some companies are, the challenge of dealing with the standards that maybe are still evolving. There are companies now who are out there who may offer large suites of products for their customers, who are looking at how they can provide frameworks, right, or platforms that allow and make it easier for others to integrate to their platforms. Can you talk a little bit about some of the evolution of those frameworks, and maybe where do you see that? Is that the next generation or next phase of facilitating this kind of horizontal integration? Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think consolidation in the industry is it's a foregone conclusion, right? I mean, Gone are the days of, I don't want to say best of breed, but it is too onerous to say I'm going to use vendor X for, and I'll just use a dated example, antivirus. I'm going to use vendor Y for device control. I'm going to use vendor Z for full drive encryption. I'm going to use so on and so forth. The benefits quickly start to decline relative to the work that imparts onto an organization. We've already talked about the skill set gap. Doesn't matter if it's 500,000 million or 2 million, it's big and it's growing. So yes, we've seen this at all places, on all parts of the network, whether it's an endpoint, whether it's a perimeter device, or whether it's in the cloud. Fewer and fewer security vendors are providing more and more of the security functionality. Is that good? Well, I think in a lot of ways it is. I think it makes some people nervous. We're not at a point of monopoly, I don't think. There's plenty of choices for firewalls or antivirus or switches and routers, kind of. But the point being is there is definite advantage to having technologies, let's call it pre-integrated from a single vendor. It just makes sense. How many agents can you put on a workstation before it just stops working? Because it has to have 50 ports open and it uses 75% of the CPU. So when you get those consolidations, whether it's through acquisition or whether it's organically, most times, depending on the company, that's a good thing. We see it at the network perimeter. Doesn't matter. Any Cisco or Palo Alto networks, for instance, I'll use as a firewall example. Both of them do traditional firewalling. Both of them do URL filtering. Both of them do insert functionality here, IPS. I think we could both argue those are all good things. Right? Gone are the days of stacks and stacks of gear from 20 different vendors that a packet has to pass through, hopefully, if it's legitimate, and make it through the other side. So I think, yes, that's a foregone conclusion, stating the obvious. Is that making it easier or harder for horizontal integration? I would argue that it actually makes it easier because now you have to integrate less stuff. And the sleeker and cleaner you can make that integration, I feel, the better off things generally would be.
Yeah, Harley, I think all of us will have our own frameworks, and that's our competitive advantage as to how our things work together as opposed to how it works horizontally. What that does cause, though, as a result for our customer is that you as our customers will have a bunch of architecture and a bunch of PowerPoints that explains this framework, this set of framework, and this set of framework. So when you're making a buying decision, what we're starting to see is the request for you overlay your framework, vendor framework, onto something as simple as NIST with 5 asset classes. The classic Sunil U matrix that they released at RSA. So all of a sudden it becomes incumbent upon us to really explain to the customer, this is what this platform, this framework from Cisco will fit into something that's industry standard, things like that. So I think that has been something that will always continue. We'll have our unique frameworks, but our customers will demand, simplify this. I don't want you to speak to me from your proprietary point of view. Give me the NIST with asset classes. Tell me what you're going to do for my organization, how my people will consume you. So that's something that I see that our customers are going to benefit from when you overlay Palo, Symantec, Cisco, all in the same. We'll get a very big picture view immediately what the portfolio is going to provide.
I think a very optimistic example of this is if you look at migration to the cloud. There's only so many cloud providers. And if you are going to secure cloud environments, you have to integrate in horizontally with the mechanisms that the cloud providers have. The agility of the cloud is gone if you can't integrate with that, and if you can't take advantage of all the provisioning and other processes that the cloud gives you. So if you look at platforms and frameworks from that perspective, I believe that is an example. You know, a lot of people just think of the standard sort of, this is my perimeter fence and my stuff's inside it. Those days are gone. Perimeter's everywhere. So you have to have a fast way of adapting to the cloud with your technologies. I don't care if it's a security technology or whether it's a identity management technology. All those have to scale quickly to integrate in with the cloud. Multi-cloud at that, right? So not everyone banks on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. So you have to be able to make sure that whatever platform you choose is going to integrate and interoperate with those types of environments. And as a company, I can tell you that the migration to the cloud continues quickly, especially in private sector, and we see the ability for customers to secure those workloads as fast as the cloud can provision them. And that's a good thing. And I think that's a prime example of horizontal integration that everybody sitting at this panel probably embraces and realizes. And from a user or a consumer standpoint, you have to understand how important that is to your mission as well.
So you mentioned, I think it was Naasief, you mentioned that each vendor is going to have their own framework, right? So do you see this, the development of these different frameworks as something that causes additional challenges, additional limitations in the environment, or is it still a matter of helping that integration?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we recognize that we're in business to maintain a competitive advantage. So if our framework is going to give us speed and competitive advantage, we certainly want to continue down that, especially when you do vertical integration. However, if we see a point for the greater good, and I'll use platform exchange grid as an example, if we think, you know what, guys, we've worked on this platform exchange grid, it's going to facilitate a lot of things. Let's donate this thing that was proprietary into open source so that they can get into our framework. All of a sudden, you see an explosion of integrations happening because we've donated a core part, which is the communication plane of our framework, into open source, and then integrations explode. So I think all of us will probably have a facet of that when it makes sense. But as far as hindering horizontal integration, if we design it with APIs in mind, and this is, in my opinion, this is how the SOAR market grew, because of problems like this. And SOAR market was born to fix this, because vendors couldn't do it by themselves. So, well, guess what? There's an opportunity, and certainly is a very healthy opportunity to do that. So I wouldn't call it any type of impediment to that when you have your custom framework, because we have to maintain our competitive advantage.
Yeah, I would just like to add that when you have an organism or a bunch of organisms get really big, and then you need to integrate with something else, and there's no connector, the market will introduce one, right? So that's where these, like a lot of orchestrators, they're like organisms. They saw a niche, they attach to it. And will they grow and flourish or get consumed? Who knows? But as long as we need to interoperate, there's always going to be that connector piece. It's just who's it going to be? That's a deep question.
Yeah. So I feel like one issue with that is the lack of dedicated developers. So sometimes SOC analysts aren't super, they're not trained in computer science, or they're not programmers, right? They're just analysts, and whenever they use the products, it needs to be fairly straightforward. And I feel like having to write a connector like that is very detrimental to, you know, horizontal integration. I don't know what the solution really is, but I'm not sure that, you know, the whole organism kind of analogy really works, because maybe a connector will pop up for one of the big frameworks, but not all of them, right? And so now you're kind of like in this weird inequality state, you know, because maybe this company who happened to buy Symantec wrote a connector for, you know, some orchestrator that they're using, but it doesn't exist for Cisco, right? So kind of on the edge about that.
So let me retort. The connector I'm talking about is be more like a Hydra. So like the Phantoms, right? They have a lot of connecting points. So that's the kind of organism, I'm trying not to name them, but that's the kind of organism that I'm talking about. You know, whether if something else pops up, maybe they absorb security companies and then they become just like us, and then they close it, and then somebody else will create connectors.
I worry that, you know, this sort of action will create kind of like stovepipes, right? They won't be really vertically integrated from like a, you know, a strict standpoint, but, you know, they'll kind of group off naturally.
Okay.
So my degree is in economics. Proud to say that. And market forces take care of everything, right? I was taught that, but in real life, does it happen often enough? Does it happen fast enough? The answer is no, right? You can kind of see what Jason's talking about there, where somebody won't necessarily rush in to fill the void right when you need it. So you have to maintain an ability to, and I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, to make sure that what you invest in today, and especially the long acquisition cycles that the federal government has, that what you invest in today is going to solve the problem in the 2 years it takes to actually acquire and deploy that, and then the next 3 years in which you're going to maintain that. And oh, by the way, it's not a static environment, it's dynamic. You're adding new projects and you require new capabilities as you move forward. So the only way to keep up with that is by having adherence to a framework, whether it's something that you donate to open source or whether it's something that allows a market force to develop a connector, or whether it's simple enough that an operator could point and click in a few places and have that connection built already. I do think that we can be there sooner than most people expect. Looking at some of the frameworks around, Palo Alto Networks included, they're thought out. No, it's not just a mechanism to apply vendor lock. I don't think any one of us up here is so proud as to say, only one of our companies can solve your security problems. It cannot. So again, in a strange way, market forces are going to demand that we satisfy what customer needs. More and more, I am seeing requirements for interoperability with open standards-based tools, open standards-based templates. So we can talk about our frameworks all we want, but if we build things that customers don't want, well,
Okay.
see ya.
Okay, so I think we have just a couple more minutes left, so we'll ask just the panel for your closing remarks, any parting thoughts that you would like to share. So Jason, we'll start at this end of the table this time.
I feel like, you know, at the end of the day, what's really going to solve this, you know, whatever it may be, whether it be OpenC2, I think a standard is really, you know, what we need for horizontal integration to become much more accessible. A cool thing that I kind of like to think about is, you know, in some point in the future, products can say, oh, I'm OpenC2 compliant, and these are the commands that I support, right? And then right off the bat, you can see exactly kind of what the product does, how it does it, and it can integrate freely with everything else that says, I'm also OpenC2 compliant.
If we look back just a handful of years, organizations were dealing with just an inundation of data. They had them from hosts, from operating systems, from firewall, from everything you could imagine. and it was too large of a task to try to centralize those. So you had the advent of SIM, Security Information and Event Management. And that allowed organizations to centralize event alert data and then draw conclusions from it. I believe that the orchestration component of what security is not far from that realization, quite honestly. So great, now I have all my security information in one place. What am I going to do about it? You can't respond at human speed anymore. The adversary is coming too fast. So what you're seeing from all of these companies at this table is the development and adherence to those frameworks that allow for that automation, certainly within our own portfolios and across a vendor spectrum as well. So I do think that while this can be looked at from a lot of different ways as a very difficult problem to solve, very smart people are working on it, many in this room here. So I do think we're off to a very bright start to automation.
Yeah, I think as an industry we have work to do. There are walls to break down. There are relationships to foster. But as to what Mike said, we've got people working on it. And with the forums such as OpenC2 pushing, nudging, a vendor picking it up and running with it, I think we're closer than we may imagine.
So I'm gonna kind of have a request, actually, from you guys, something to take back to work. I'm guessing most of you are either in management or you have someone that you manage or can mentor at your companies. I would ask that you let them work on those projects that they're passionate about, especially some of these open source projects. Sorry to end it on a totally weird note, but but I think it's powerful it's very powerful to unleash those few people in your company that are going to help this move forward, right? These, especially the young people coming in with these crazy new ideas of everything should be connected and all these open APIs and all. Try to get the legal obstacles out of their way, help them with those problems that they may not be comfortable addressing or they don't even know they have to address, so keep them out of trouble. But try to give them the opportunity to work on these projects, please. So that's not a geeky ask, that's a kind of an HR ask.
All right, so first of all, I want to thank you. I think you've given us an awful lot of insights and some things to think about in terms of the challenges, but also where we need to go and the work that still needs to be done. So just a round of applause.